Hi, this is Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Thanking you for checking out this series, this trauma and healing series brought to you by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. Hi, I'm Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Today, in one of a series of Brother Be Well conversations on trauma and healing, made possible by the support of Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative, we're talking about trauma triggers. If you don't know what they are, hold on tight. You're in for a great conversation. For me, learning about trauma triggers was transformative during my journey to mental health, and I'm going to share some of that journey with you as we unpack trauma triggers with marriage and family therapist and Brother Be Well clinical advisor Christian Jacobs. Christian, what's up? Welcome back to Brother Be Well. Let's get right at it, Christian. Let's briefly define trauma for someone. You and I have been together for a while, but let's define trauma for someone who hasn't caught one of our earlier conversations during this series. What exactly is trauma?
Sure. Trauma is an emotional response, mentally and psychologically. So it's really a psychological response to a traumatic event, such as violence or racism or school shootings, and this is also either being a witness to it or actually being the first victim in that situation. It could be sexual abuse, verbal abuse, things of that sort, and also a person who experiences that shock value, that shock and denial phase is also a form of trauma. Trauma can also, occur from direct exposure, or as I was saying, either learning it or hearing it, third party or seeing it on the news. So it can happen in a myriad of ways, when you talk about the experience of trauma.
Let's talk about, as we talk about triggers, there's a difference between a term, I'm being triggered, and that triggered me. We use those terms a lot rather, but there's a difference between being triggered and being uncomfortable. Often we conflate those two. So can you describe a trauma trigger? What exactly is that?
Yes, I know people sometimes say something is a trigger when in reality they mean something and they maybe got them upset or something, they're bothered, but it's almost sometimes it can be like a form of slang, right?
Right.
But I think it would be helpful, if I provide more definition and context to that term trigger. A trigger really is, if you can visualize it, it could be a person, a place, a feeling, or a thing that immediately induces a stress-based physical or emotional response based on past traumatic experiences. And when that stress-based physical response occurs, of course, as we talked about in our other podcasts and other recordings, is that certain chemicals are released to help ease the body, such as cortisol and these other oxytocins that occur in the body that's trying to appease the body that's going through that painful experience. So triggers can really be internally generated by feelings or stress. So you're looking at anger, sadness, or causes that are really rooted in an external environment. So you have those external ideas as well. And really being uncomfortable is maybe something you experienced was really undesirable, like having a door slammed in your face, but it wasn't traumatic and doesn't really induce those physical and emotional stress indicators we talked about, right? So every time you walk by a door, you're not triggered. It may have been uncomfortable, someone slamming the door in your face, but it wasn't traumatic for you. So if a person, place, or feeling or thing gets like a rise out of you to the point physically, you may start getting hot or hands getting sweaty, or you start to tear up. You may have been triggered. So that's something you may want to look into.
So to make sure I understand before we move on, the door slammed in your face example, if you walk by a door later and you're reminded of the door having been slammed, but you don't have a physiological reaction to that, you're probably not triggered. But if
Exactly.
something happens and it kind of causes a change in your body, you might want to think about whether or not that's triggering to you. Is that accurate?
Exactly, exactly. Because everyone responds to trauma differently.
Got it. Thank you, sir. I've learned as I got ready to talk to you, sir, that we need to be aware of internal and external triggers. So can you talk about and differentiate between the two of those?
Yeah, so many times if we pay attention to our bodies, you'll feel the emotion physically if you really pay attention. And you ever became so angry that maybe you subconsciously your fists were balled up as you're talking, or like so nervous that you've subconsciously torn up 10 napkins under the table or scratched a hole through your jeans? Well, hopefully not scratching a hole through your jeans. But seriously, like, the trigger that caused all this may be internally generated, which could be an emotion, memory, pain is another good example, frustration, loneliness. So these are some of the internal indicators that could happen. So I just want to actually tell you a story. Years ago, I was in a long-term relationship, right? And it ended, rather abruptly. And around the winter times, around October, November, December, I believe Thanksgiving and Christmas was coming up. Actually, those holidays passed. Um, and that breakup happened around that time period, that holiday, that, the winter, it was foggy, it was rainy. Don't you know that it took years for me to stop associating wintertime and the holidays with a bad experience, such as a breakup? It took years of good memories afterwards to kind of heal that wound. It took several years to really kind of reprogram my brain to learn that, the holidays is not a negative experience. So a person can be triggered externally, those smells, that example I gave you was internal, right? So external could be something like smells or the media, watching the news, arguments, seeing violence, seeing a certain person that you see in the store or someone from your childhood. But the only way to really to know the difference is by practicing that mindfulness component, those mindfulness techniques that will help you identify what's going on in your body, so you'll know what you're feeling and what's going on, and B, if it's external or internal, so you can label it. You can start to name those responses, which is something that's a really good trait, a really good tool to have, and see if it's a trigger or just something that you're uncomfortable with. So you can say, you know what, this is something I may be uncomfortable with. It's not something that's severely traumatic for me in my experience.
I appreciate you sharing the personal story, Christian. I had a similar experience with my father dying, and he died in the fall. And I was living in the Midwest at the time. So for the longest time, that's been almost 20 years ago, and it's only been recently that the change in the color of the leaves doesn't bring about that sort of the physical response to losing my dad. I couldn't get away from that. It took several years of, as you just said, great falls and positive experiences to kind of undo that. Before we move on, I think I got internal triggers. Could you mention again external, the difference between what? Give me a couple of examples of an external trigger, just to make sure everybody's got
Yeah, so an external trigger can be anything environmental. It could be something that happens outside of your body. So you're talking about an external event such as, a car accident or a smell or seeing a person. Those are all external. Internal is an emotion. So it could be something like a memory. So that's an internal thing that you can't, it's not tangible. You can't touch it or see it, or anger, and other emotions. So those are the internal and the external triggers. And the difference really lies with, as it really sounds like, are you able to see, feel, hear, or touch it? Or are you able to feel it, feel that emotion? So those are the main differences between the two.
Got it. Appreciate you clarifying that for me and for anybody else watching. I also want to mention, you mentioned mindfulness as being a tool. If you're interested in learning about mindfulness, go to brotherrewell.com. Grace Cecilio is our brilliant mindfulness expert, so you can check out videos and podcasts with Grace at brotherbewell.com. Christian, you mentioned a person, and that leads me to the next question. I almost didn't add this question to the list because I thought I knew the answer to it, but I'm going to let you answer emphatically. Can a person then, an individual, be a trigger?
Oh yes, I would beg to differ that I think most individuals deal with a person as a trigger, and sometimes it's really subconscious where they don't know it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So absolutely, yeah, a person can be. And I think most people, relate to this. This is more relatable because, we deal with people on an everyday basis. So I have another example for you. True story here. I had a, teacher that always, called on us when we knew, when it was time to read, right? So at times, I didn't feel comfortable. I was a good reader, but I was a little shy. So when I would read, I would stutter a lot, when I was younger. So I get nervous and start stuttering. So she would always call, on me, and I know I couldn't read that well at that time. So now I have two triggers going on. I have an internal one, which is a pain from the memory, right? Internal, emotional. That's the internal pain. And I have the external trigger, right? Which is every time I see that teacher, it could be a person, place, or location. I see that teacher, it brings back bad memories. So I had two things going on there. So absolutely, a person can be a trigger, and that's where most of us associate some of our triggers with.
I really wish I had. I'm remembering just really briefly my own mental health journey, and I remember sitting in a therapist's office the first time, and she was explaining triggers to me. I knew nothing about them, you talk about an epiphany. As she was talking, I said, "Wait, can a person be a trigger?" And she was almost surprised. Of course, Michael. Yes. And I just went. I think you talk about an aha moment when you realize that maybe just limiting interactions. We're not talking about necessarily cutting somebody out of your life, but if you're just aware, if a person is a trigger, you might want to limit the number of interactions or the length of time that you're interacting with someone if you know they're going to trigger that response that you don't really want to trigger. So appreciate you running us through that, Christian. Really appreciate it.